Hi, I'm Jesse Ammett, your host on Valley News Now. Today, former President Donald Trump is set to be arraigned in an historic event. Right now, he is in the courtroom at the Manhattan courthouse, being processed, fingerprinted, getting his mug shot taken, and will be arraigned very soon. He's expected to be arraigned on charges related to hush money paid to adult film star Stormy Daniels during the 2016 presidential campaign. Lots of protesters out today, too, some obviously in favor, some obviously echoing the feelings of Donald Trump. The booking and appearance should be brief, although not at all normal, as he's fingerprinted and learns the charges against him. The conviction, though, does not prevent Trump from running for or winning the presidency in 2012. So inside the Manhattan courthouse right now, awaiting arraignment. We're going to go to the live shot now.
The conspiracy or what's
well, that's going to be very interesting because election law is usually prosecuted at a federal level. So what's the New York law that's going to be broken here if they're talking about campaign finance?
Well, and the other factor is that when Cy Vance, the previous DA, was looking into the case against Donald Trump, he was also looking into a different case. He was looking into property valuations,
yes,
up for loans and down for taxes. And that's a different case than this case, or is it? We're going to find out.
Okay, let's just a minute, because I just want to regroup here and let everyone know what we're looking at. These are live pictures from just outside what is the largest courtroom at this Manhattan criminal courthouse, where Judge Juan Merchan is there, and they will read the charges against Donald Trump. And there we see the district attorney, I believe, just quickly. There are questions about whether he will be, in fact, inside that courtroom. Want to bring in our senior investigative correspondent, Catherine Herridge. She is there at the courthouse. And Catherine, who else do we expect to be inside that courtroom?
Well, Nora, good to be with you. We expect that courtroom on one of the upper levels in the courthouse behind me to be at capacity. Our colleagues Scott McFarland and Graham Cates will be in either the main courtroom or the overflow room. And to give you some context about what the demand was to watch history unfold, beginning yesterday at around 3 p.m. local time, a building just about 25 yards to my right, a lot of journalists and others began lining up for one of two color-coded passes. One pass would get them into that main courtroom where the former president will be arraigned. That's about 60 people. And then two overflow courtrooms, one 110 and the other 100. I also just want to make a note about the judge here, Judge Merchan. I spoke with a lawyer late yesterday who has appeared before the judge, and he described him as rough, tough, and someone who would not suffer unnecessary delays, and also emphasized that he has so much familiarity with the Trump Organization prosecution because he presided over that case, and significantly, he did not allow the defense attorneys in that case to argue something called selective prosecution. And that may be one of the key legal arguments for the former president as his case goes forward, Nora.
It's an excellent point, Catherine Herridge. Thank you. Also want to bring in Richard Esposito, the former NYPD deputy commissioner. And Richard, we are going to get pictures from still photographers at the beginning of this arraignment proceedings. But what we see right now is a very heavy law enforcement presence. Talk about that.
Yes, I think there are at least 250 reporters packed into the courtroom and the overflow room. In the courtroom itself, we're told at least 24 court officers. That's a very heavy presence. There's a source that says there'll be a court officer in every pew, and a source that says the Secret Service is keeping the seats closest to the aisle that the president would walk down empty, vacant for security reasons. So we're going to see a packed courtroom, a lot of blue and white shirts of security officers. There'll be senior court officials in the back of the room. Those are the ones with the white shirts. And you can see from the presence outside, and this was the courtroom Harvey Weinstein was tried in, it's already a significant presence right outside the court. And as you noted, the DA took that short walk that former President Trump's going to take from the elevator to the court in his case. And then we'll see how he's protected as he goes in.
And Richard, I understand you've been reporting this morning about a new spate of email threats against the district attorney. What have you learned?
What we learned this morning was from the folks who investigate cyber threats that they'd received another spate of these email threats against District Attorney Bragg, one of them saying there was a bomb, another one saying with a detonator. And it looked like the threats were coming through a Russian server. There's some suspicion that that could be mischief, hacking to cause trouble, but they still have to go through the server back to the internet provider and make sure it's not being masked and it's actually a domestic threat. Nothing has yielded anything that emergency service or bomb squads are concerned about, but they're going to run each of these down, Nora.
Richard Esposito, thank you. We should note that in New York, falsifying business records can be a crime, and we are told that Mr. Bragg has built his case around that very charge. I want to bring in Ricky Kleeman. Ricky, do we expect the district attorney to be there sitting at the table inside that courtroom?
It's really up to him. His assistants have handled this case throughout with the grand jury. His assistants are the people who will try the case. But he may want to show his presence, show he is unafraid, show this is his case, and take possession of a seat at the table, or he may not.
We have been reporting, we're talking about more than 30 counts against Donald Trump. Will they all be felony counts?
We don't know. Certainly, it makes sense that if you're going to take a check and say that that is falsifying a business record along with an entry in a journal and say that that's a misdemeanor, that would be very foolish indeed. You may as well wrap it around the other crime that allegedly would be the crime of concealment, whether it's federal or state, and at that point make them all felonies.
On the grounds that this conduct essentially was intended to conceal another underlying crime.
Correct.
Perhaps an election law crime. On that note, we have an expert on that very topic, so I want to bring in Jerry Goldfeder. He is an election and campaign finance lawyer. Jerry, so good to have you with us. Answer that charge that has been made. Well, why is this illegal that Trump paid off someone he may have had an affair with? What's wrong with that?
Well, if he's good to see you, if it's proven that he has conspired, perhaps with Cohn, perhaps with the National Enquirer people, to unlawfully promote his own election, that's a violation of state election law. Normally, a federal candidate goes by federal election law, and the federal election law preempts, oversees, supersedes New York State and every state election law, except there are exceptions. So if, in fact, the indictment states that he conspired to promote his own election by unlawful means, by violating state election laws, Alvin Bragg is on solid ground.
And what would that mean in terms of when this case goes to trial?
It would mean that he has to, the district attorney needs to prove beyond a reasonable doubt, and the jury needs to accept the fact that, in fact, all these transactions, the hush money payments, were in furtherance of the presidential election. His defense is it has nothing to do with the election. It had to do with Melania, his family, God knows what. And the jury is going to have to adopt the district attorney's evidence, testamentary evidence and documentary evidence, beyond a reasonable doubt that, in fact, it was related to the election.
Well, why else would have Donald Trump given money to Stormy Daniels?
That's a good question, and we'll hear his defense. It's like when John Edwards was indicted a number of years ago for the very similar situation, and his defense was he was really trying to protect his family life, his reputation, having nothing to do with the campaign, and the jury in that case was not convinced by the prosecutor. So it's up to District Attorney Bragg to prove this case and for the jurors to adopt it, to accept that.
It's just extraordinary to think about what has happened in the last many years that Donald Trump ran for president and was president of the United States, and all these legal cases that have come about since.
And presumably that would go back to your point, Bob. Does the district attorney have any evidence that Donald Trump was thinking or trying to engage in this in the furtherance of getting around those campaign laws? Or does he have a witness beyond maybe Michael Cohen, maybe David Pecker, who says, we had a conversation specifically about this campaign piece of it, and that adds to, it's not just speculation, that you have somebody who was in the room when that conversation was happening and that Donald Trump was participating in that conversation.
And while this has been widely reported, just to remind everybody, Robert, again, because you just interviewed Michael Cohen, who was sent to jail because of this, how the money was funneled to Michael Cohen, who then paid Stormy Daniels, to just remind everybody.
So in 2016, Donald Trump's running for the presidency, and he wants to keep bad stories out of the news. And it's not illegal to have what's called a non-disclosure agreement. You can pay someone in this country to not speak about a certain issue if you do it above the level, on the level. But what happened here, according to Cohen's version of events, is that Donald Trump told him, when he was a candidate for the presidency, told his fixer, Michael Cohen, to take care, with David Pecker, working at the National Enquirer at the time, of this Stormy Daniels situation and potentially other allegations like Karen McDougal, women who have claimed to have had different kinds of encounters and affairs with Donald Trump.
She was the Playboy model?
Playboy model, Karen McDougal. And so you see what Cohen did is pay them, in Stormy Daniels' case, $130,000. But it was labeled as legal fees. And that labeling of legal fees is what's under scrutiny now by the district attorney of Manhattan. Instead of calling it a non-disclosure agreement and just saying it is what it is, it was labeled as legal fees. And that decision, alleged decision by Trump, implicates him in a possible conspiracy in the eyes of those investigating this case.
Let's bring in Nicole Killian, who covers Congress for us. And Nicole, we have seen a number of Republicans in Congress and others who hold political office denouncing the district attorney while not exactly defending Donald Trump. Break down that reaction for us.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, what you've seen is a number of congressional Republicans really in lockstep here, whether you're looking at party loyalists like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who was there in New York protesting near the courthouse, saying that Donald Trump is innocent and that this is a weaponization of government. This is a line that we are hearing from some party leaders as well, such as Kevin McCarthy, the House Speaker, who has called this an abuse of power and who has said that the House will hold the Manhattan DA to account. And you have 3 congressional committee chairs who have been trading letters back and forth with the district attorney, trying to get him to sit down for a transcribed interview. Where we really see the daylight here is more among Senate Republicans. For instance, Mitch McConnell, still suffering from a fall. He's been out of Congress for a couple of weeks now. Have not heard much reaction from him. Also, when you look at some of these 2024 candidates, while many have backed the former president, for instance, we know Governor Ron DeSantis may potentially launch a presidential bid for 2024. He has aligned himself with the former president on this, as have other presidential hopefuls. But you have people like Asa Hutchinson, the former governor of Arkansas, who just announced a couple of days ago, one of the first to come out and say that the former president should withdraw from this race. In fact, he told me a couple of weeks ago that he thinks the former president has disqualified himself by the way in which he handled himself during January 6th, and that in his view, this is just a distraction and a sideshow that the party doesn't need right now.
Yeah, Asa Hutchinson, the former Arkansas governor, departing from some of his Republican colleagues and drawing a line in the sand about whether Trump should continue this race.
It's an intriguing political moment because, with respect to the former governor of Arkansas, not someone with a high national profile, but it's someone with his stature who's deciding that this is a moment to get into the Republican presidential race. But you don't see Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin or Florida Governor Ron DeSantis suddenly announcing their campaigns because they know that Trump is now consolidating a lot of support. Yes, he has a new challenger in Asa Hutchinson, but that's about it at this point. What's also interesting, based on what we just heard from Nicole, is that the Republican Party, while publicly seem to be rallying around Trump, I don't see many other House Republicans there, Senate Republicans. Where are they? Marjorie Taylor Greene, the Georgia Congresswoman, is there.
Meaning it's a handful of people.
It's a handful of people. It's Marjorie Taylor Greene's a congresswoman who appeared with the white nationalists at an event a few years ago. Nick Fuentes, that's who she is. She has a high national profile. George Santos, most New Yorkers and people nationally, we don't need to go there, but we know he's controversial.
Admitted liar.
Admitted liar. And so that's who's showing up. Where are the other senators and House members? There's a reluctance for so many of them to get there in the arena with Trump at a time of trouble. They'll send a tweet, they'll make a statement, but they don't want to get too close to a situation that's volatile.
And that is the key question. Will the media spotlight on Trump motivate his base? Will it paralyze the Republican opponents? Will it help him win the Republican nomination for 2024? I want to bring in our chief Washington correspondent, Major Garrett. He is at Trump's Palm Beach, Florida resident, Mar-a-Lago. And Major, I know the president planning to return there tonight and speak to his crowd. What are you learning?
Yes. So, Nora, it's a New York story right now, but it's going to be a primetime Mar-a-Lago story this evening. The president will return to Mar-a-Lago and this evening give some remarks, probably in response to what Alvin Bragg, the district attorney in Manhattan, tells reporters and the nation about the indictment, its relationship to the law, and the facts. But here's something we already know. The former president of the United States wants to monetize this moment. He's been trying to monetize it for weeks, but he's really trying to monetize it this very moment, because if you, like many reporters and many Americans, get emails from the Trump campaign, you just got an email that said mugshot, new item. It's not the mugshot. It's just a Photoshop. It's, in every classical sense, a head fake. It's a picture of the president. It's not the mugshot. Mugshot's not going to be taken. It doesn't exist. But you can get that fake mugshot on a T-shirt if you send in, and here's the clever number, 47. Let's do the math. 45th president, Joe Biden 46th. 47. There we go. So in this moment when at the panel and throughout this entire judicial process, there's meticulous care about whether there will or won't be a mugshot, no, it doesn't really matter. In the Trump world and the monetization moment, it exists, if only for the purposes of raising campaign donations.
And Major, to do some drilling down on that, for people who think that they're sending in that $47 to help Donald Trump run for president, how much of that money is being spent on the campaign and how much of it is being spent on his legal defenses?
So the campaign is the one sending out this email. It's not from one of his super PACs. It's the Joint Committee for Donald Trump for President. So it is a campaign solicitation. And the campaign, because the Republican National Committee will no longer pay Donald Trump's legal bills, will have to pay that. So you can further the campaign interest, the political interest of the former president, or you can help him out on the legal side. Either way, whatever the campaign decides to do with that money, it's up to the campaign, but it is clearly for the president's campaign in 2024 for the first Republican nomination, and if he secures it, the presidency of the United States.
So he can use it for legal fees?
Indeed. Look, campaigns have legal fees, and it would be up to the campaign to decide if this is the allocation that it wants to make in order to do that. And there are plenty of documents that show that the Trump campaign has allocated funds for legal expenses. This particular case, at this particular moment, we'll have to wait for the filings on that, but it is permissible.
And Major, what about what we're expecting to see tonight when Donald Trump returns to Mar-a-Lago?
So Mar-a-Lago is the place where he is safest. He is very revered. It is a private club, so a good number of the crowd tonight, we're estimating or getting estimates, 500 to 700 will be club members, and therefore fans and paying customers of Mar-a-Lago. There'll also be invited guests. Some members of Congress who have long been in the trenches with former President Trump may be here. And the length of the remarks, we don't know yet. And whatever they are now, and there's a sense we've gotten that they have some prepared remarks, but they are going to deal, at least in part, with what the district attorney in Manhattan says when he talks to reporters later this afternoon. And my guess is, whatever that district attorney says, Alvin Bragg, on behalf of this case, the facts, the assertions, and how they fit with New York law, the president will reshape his remarks to respond specifically to those assertions from the district attorney. But Mar-a-Lago is, if anything, a very safe space for former President Trump. He wants the primetime visibility. He wants to make sure he's on plenty of cable networks and churning the story as much as he possibly can. And, oh, not incidentally, monetize it along the way.
And there we see members of Trump's legal team that have just exited out those doors. So it probably means just any moment now we are going to see Donald Trump.
We just saw Boris Epstein, one of his longtime political and legal advisors there, walking out of the room.
Who is also under legal scrutiny right now. In some of these other cases, he's being questioned.
We should note that in that group of people that we just saw, not only Boris Epstein, but of course Joe Tacopina, who we've seen on television, as well as Susan Necheles, who is one of his Trump defense attorneys as well. Let's listen in now.
President Trump, will you come speak to us? President Trump?
That was a sober-looking President Trump.
No handcuffs that we saw, walking with his arms.
I wonder if he made a decision, even though a member of his team said that he may speak to the cameras there, if he decided this was not a shot or a piece of sound he wanted to be remembered for.
Or maybe his legal team suggested that it's not the appropriate time.
Yeah. And not every, he's a former television producer. But at the end of the day, go back to what we heard right when this indictment came down. He didn't like it. He was stunned by it. He didn't think Bragg was going to move forward. He doesn't want to be arrested. He doesn't want to be arraigned. Yes, he's going to use it for his political campaign. But personally, this is not a moment he has welcomed, based on our reporting.
I wonder if Scott Frederickson is still with us, who is a former federal prosecutor who has focused on white-collar criminal defense. And Scott, you see the president's face there, and as you know, this can be a sobering moment when you're under arrest and you've been fingerprinted and read your rights.
Well, that's exactly right. The fact is, for legal purposes, an arraignment is simply a start of proceedings. It really has little consequences other than we get to see the charges today. But there is an emotional impact, in my experience as a prosecutor and defense counsel, that is rather stunning. It's the first time for most people when they are exposed to our criminal justice system. They realize they're in custody. They're with law enforcement. They are not free to move. They see bars. They see a holding cell. They see locked doors. They realize their freedom is no longer theirs. So for most individuals, this experience is embarrassing, humiliating, and somewhat frightening. They see the future they might have.
He's technically under arrest right now?
Mm-hmm. That's correct.
I have seen, to echo Scott's comments, that when I have brought people, particularly white-collar people, into being processed, that even the most arrogant, even the most boisterous, suddenly become very, very quiet. Mm-hmm. It is sobering as your word. That really is the right word. It really dawns on you that your life will never be the same.
Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry.
Well, going back to Bob's point, it's wise to remember that this is also may very well be the staging that Donald Trump, for whatever reason, wants at the moment. But the other thing is that Donald Trump does not like to be constrained when he doesn't want to be constrained. And if this is a moment of constraint, that would be uncomfortable if that, in fact, is what we're seeing and not a staged determination on his part.
I want to bring back in Richard Esposito, because, Richard, you can talk about what's just happened in the past 20 minutes.
It's a very sobering 20 minutes. You walk into an office with district attorney's office investigators and prosecutors. They inform you you're under arrest. That's a sobering moment right there. You read your Miranda rights, and it's explained to you how to put your fingers onto a electronic pad where your fingerprints will be taken. It's a moment when people often say you look over your shoulder and look at the things you might not ever see again, whether it's a taxi passing or someone you used to know, because for many defendants, this is the start of a long stay in jail.
We should just note what you just saw were the still photographers who were allowed inside the courtroom to take a picture at the beginning of these proceedings. Those will be published shortly. We will bring those to you. We should also note we have reporters from CBS News, one inside that very courtroom, who will be able to give a bird's eye view. They are not allowed to use their electronic devices right now, but we will have a report. We also have other reporters in those outside overflow rooms as well, so we can tell you exactly what happened inside.
And before we get that picture, which has an important role in our legal system, and we can talk about it once we get it, but can we go back just a second to the picture being sent out by the Trump campaign? He's running as an outlaw. This is a way in which today is a reality created by the judicial system. But then there's the circus reality, which is there was no mugshot, but they've created one in order to create a reality about an outlaw kind of candidate. That's, again, a way in which the unreality of the circus, which we've seen through the Trump years, which is a person who's very skilled at creating his own reality, is bumping up with the real reality, which is there's no mugshot, but also that he was arrested today.
You know, Robert, I was struck by when Richard was talking about what Donald Trump just went through, being surrounded by these prosecutors, being fingerprinted, being read his rights. It popped into mind as someone who has spent some time with Donald Trump, and I know you've spent a lot of time with him for interviews that you've done with Bob Woodward. He's a man that likes to be in charge of the room. He takes up a lot of oxygen. He talks a lot. He's domineering. He can be aggressive. In this case, he would not be able to be the Donald Trump that we all know.
The first time I met Donald Trump back in 2011, went up to Trump Tower, and you go to that 26th floor office, what's on the wall? Pictures of himself on magazine covers, pictures of himself with celebrities.
Yeah.
This is someone who for his entire life has studied the image of Donald Trump, cultivated the image of Donald Trump. You think about him in interviews. I've always said it's best to interview Trump over the phone because in person there's always the character of Trump, the presentation of Trump. This has been key to his business career. It's not just about buildings and golf courses. It's about marketing a brand. When you look at his valuations of his fortune over the years, you'd always value his brand at the highest level of his entire fortune. And so now to have his brand, his image associated with this sober walk into a courtroom in Lower Manhattan. This is an area that's not full of skyscrapers. This is not an area where a lot of people go to dinner at night, though Soho is nearby. What you're looking at is a place where they often film the TV show Law and Order. This is gritty. This is not the Donald Trump image he has worked so hard to maintain.
And he did that in New York. You know, I covered him here in New York for years. And he was Mr. New York. You know, the people on this, hey, Donald, they loved him. But now he comes here and it's like he's a visitor in his own hometown. He doesn't hang around too long. He gets back to Florida where now he feels more comfortable. But here is where he became who he is, in part because of that branding of buildings and his reputation, his TV shows, but also because he is someone from Queens. He grew up with this chip on his shoulder, always wanted to fit in with the wealthiest of Manhattan's wealthy. And here he is, humbled in this courthouse in Lower Manhattan. It is really a sobering picture.
And he spent a lot of his career in New York working politicians and officials like the former Manhattan District Attorney Robert Morgenthau, with whom he had a long relationship, because he always felt that you could work the system, and that's not possible for him at this moment.
And he did that as a Democrat and someone who funded many Democratic causes before switching parties to run and become a Republican president of the United States. Ricky, let's talk about what's happening right now inside this courtroom.
Well, I can assume that inside the courtroom that it will get called to order or has been called to order by the court clerk. People will rise for the judge to come in. The judge will then make an order to unseal the indictment. At that point, the defendant will be able to see it, his lawyers will be able to see it, and hopefully soon we will be able to see it. There may be proceedings after that time in terms of any conditions that the judge may want or the DA may want in terms of his release. He will be released. He does not have to post any bail.
The doors are open again. We're watching this very closely as a number of different officials are led inside or out of these courtrooms with heavy law enforcement present. Let's bring in Jerry Goldfeder, who is an election and campaign finance lawyer. And Jerry, what's been happening inside that courtroom right now?
Well, they're getting ready for the judge to take the bench and to begin proceedings. And let's not make any mistake about it. This judge is a very serious lawman. He will control this courtroom. He will make certain that everything goes according to protocol in a very serious, somber, sober way. So whatever kinds of drama we have outside the building or even in the corridors are not going to occur in this courtroom. And I think that's the reason why the judge made the determination not to have cameras in the courtroom. I think the procedure is going to go just by the book, according to the judge's wishes.
We are just getting the first picture in from inside that courtroom with Donald Trump surrounded by his new legal team, as well as some of his previous legal counsel there, and facing these particular charges. We should talk about Judge Juan Merchan, who has previously presided over the convictions and guilty plea just last year of 2 Trump Organization companies and their former chief financial officer, Alan Weisselberg. He's also overseeing the criminal proceedings involving Steve Bannon. He has been a justice in Manhattan State Supreme Court for 14 years, and he's been described as someone who is pretty straightforward and tough. One question is whether he will impose a gag order today.
The difficulty, Nora, about the gag order is this. How do you enforce it? You have someone who is running for the office of President of the United States. So he violates the gag order, should one have been imposed. What are you going to do? Hold him in contempt and put him in jail? That's ridiculous. So even though I think a gag order may well be warranted to have both sides not talk about this case, I don't think it can be enforced. So why do it?
Okay, what about then the continued attacks on this judge and today his family as well? Previously, Donald Trump had put on his social media that this judge hates me. Today, he denounced his family as well. Can Donald Trump continue to personally attack the judge, the district attorney, and others?
Well, the difficulty is what I say. How do you stop him except by throwing him in jail, which does not really serve anyone? The difficulty is really also his argument that goes back to January 6th, free speech.
Well, I want to bring in Jerry Goldfeder one more time because, Jerry, we already know Donald Trump wants this judge to recuse himself. He wants the trial moved to Staten Island.
That's right. And I think all of his statements on his social media and as well as pumping up his crowds go to his strategy of trying to move this trial away from New York County and to try to get the judge, if he can't do that, to try to get rid of this judge, because he believes, and perhaps rightly so, that this judge really knows him, really knows his organization, and is probably not disposed to look upon him in any favorable light. So I think that is his strategy at this point. I don't think it's going to work. I think this judge is going to retain jurisdiction, and I think this trial is going to occur in New York County.
Donald Trump has been arrested. He's been booked. He's been fingerprinted. He is now being likely read this indictment, which we are all anxiously awaiting to hear what is in it.
He's learning the facts of the case right now, and his ears are coming whatever is up there against him. Ricky, I want to ask you a question, which is, as one of his lawyers, is the advice likely to be, hey, stop attacking the judge, because the judge may hold your future in some of his rulings? I mean, it may make your future easier or harder depending on how he rules. So isn't it always better not to attack the judge?
Of course, it's better not to attack the judge. And of course, if I were his lawyer, and I'm sure that when you have lawyers who have real quality, the addition of Todd Blanche is a wonderful addition. They are telling him to just stop. They are telling him that anything he says could be used against him in a court of law. You do not want your client talking, let alone threatening. I do think that it really is true what Jerry says, that this is a strategy to try to get the judge to recuse himself. I also agree it's not going to work. So what you do is you've gotten under the skin of a judge, but a judge like this, with his reputation, is going to push it aside, and he is going to rule fairly in the courtroom. But does it serve you in the end? You don't want that subconscious going to say that this is someone who is threatening me, let alone my family.
in recent days, I was talking to people close to Donald Trump, and I said, what's he saying behind the scenes? And they said, it's not just what he's saying, it's what he's sending. He has been sending some friends and advisors articles about the crowd size in Waco, Texas, where he recently had a rally where his message was very grievance-driven. And that is a sign to me as a reporter that what's coming is political war. If you're the judge in this case or the prosecutor, you may want this to unfold in a certain way, abiding by certain norms. But you are in a norm-free zone when you deal with former President Donald Trump. He is on the march, on the campaign trail, trying to run for the Republican nomination. And he has shown in every instance of his recent life that he will shatter a norm at a moment's notice if he believes it will get him ahead.
Well, he tried to shatter norms by inciting a mob on the Capitol of the United States, the January 6th insurrection. He now faces legal jeopardy because of that. And those that ended up storming the Capitol have also met the long arm of the law, with more than 1,000 charged and many of them in jail for what they did. So when people question, will there be accountability for the former president and those who answered his call, we've begun to see some accountability. No?
And I think, you know, if those cases, the January 6 cases, have helped law enforcement in this case. And I say that because you have this former president who's trying to rile up his supporters. But if you look at what some of his...
There weren't big protests here in New York.
Exactly,
right?
Because some of his supporters are saying, wait a second, it's a trap. It's a, false flag operation. The police are going to get us if we show up. They don't want to go to jail. Exactly.
I want to bring in Scott McFarland. We mentioned we have reporters who have been witnessing what's happening inside that courtroom. Scott, tell us what you've been seeing.
Donald Trump has just pleaded not guilty to 34 counts of falsifying business records in the first degree. He's seated at the defense table, surrounded by 3 defense attorneys, wearing his suit and his red tie, spoke in a pretty loud voice when he said not guilty, as the clerk of Judge Juan Marchon read the top line. 34 counts of falsifying business records in the first degree. This is ongoing as we speak, Nora. But we have this development from the courtroom. This arraignment began moments ago, took very little time to get to the plea from the 45th President of the United States.
Scott McFarland, you are the only one reporting this right now. You've been witnessing what happened inside that courtroom. What did it look like when Trump entered?
Well, he walked in slowly, and once he sat down, the pool photographers, the still photographers were brought in, a few of them, and he smiled in their direction as they got their cameras ready. They read the case number. This is for the history book. This case is number 71543-23 here in the Manhattan courthouse. He sat with no paper, no pens in front of him. His attorneys all had books out and pens out. He just sat with his hands in his lap, kind of hunched over at this old wooden defense table. This is such an old, dank courtroom. It's not the palatial or grand courtrooms in the federal system. And it's a very humble courtroom, and he is sitting with his shoulders slumped, his hands in his lap.
What can you tell us about those 34 counts? We don't have any idea yet what's in that indictment. What have you heard?
Well, this is what we're going to find out in the coming minutes, but it's all the same count according to the clerk who read the indictment. 34 counts of falsifying business records in the first degree. There is possibly some connected tissue between falsifying business records and some other crime. But that's what's ongoing now in the courtroom. There is an overflow courtroom just across the hall, and both of them are pretty jam-packed with spectators, not just journalists, but citizens who waited in line since 1 in the morning to get a seat in here. Former president, as you'd imagine, Nora, is just surrounded by law enforcement, not just Secret Service, but there is New York police, there is New York State court security, and there is a group of police out in the hallway monitoring activity here. No phones allowed in the courtroom, and the judge got a challenge from the media organizations to open this up to phones and laptops and to cameras, and the judge rejected all those motions. So all this is happening behind closed doors with a feed, a video and audio feed going across the hallway to an overflow room.
Scott McFarland has been witnessing Donald Trump inside that courtroom as they read the criminal charges against him. Scott, just to recap, what did Donald Trump do when asked for his plea?
He answered immediately. in a voice that was noticeably louder than the attorneys who were speaking here today, and said simply, not guilty. No adjectives before it, nothing after it, just not guilty. And at this point, they're running through the procedures that will happen after this arraignment ends. There are going to be certainly deadlines set for motions, for future hearings. All that's happening as I'm speaking to you, Nora. But the bottom line here is it's 34 counts of the same charge, according to the clerk. 34 counts of falsifying business records in the first degree. There's more to gather, but let me just paint a picture for you here, Nora. This is such a humble place. The 15th floor of this courthouse in Manhattan looks like an old middle school hallway. That type of flooring, that type of walls. It is sweltering, stuffy hot in here and in the courtroom. And all of this looks like something out of the TV show Night Court, not something out of one of the grand courthouses in Washington or in the federal system nationwide. The limited camera access here, which the Trump team asked for, saying cameras might turn this into a circus-like atmosphere, are perhaps sparing some of the images of a very meek and humble place.
Scott, you are the only one who has come out from that overflow room to give us this first-hand account. It is riveting to listen to the details that you have. I know Robert Costa has a question for you.
Scott, terrific reporting. It's just amazing to get these vivid details right by the moment. Did Trump stand up? Did the former president stand up when he pleaded not guilty? Did he stay seated? Give me the whole version of events from your eye.
Everybody is seated, at least for the opening minutes of this, Bob. Trump is seated. His attorneys on either side. He's got two attorneys on his right, one attorney on his left. The attorneys we've seen on television included. Joe Tacopina is to Trump's left. Susan McAuliffe to his right, and Tom Blanche, his newly hired attorney, further to his right. He is seated, Trump and his defense team, to the judge's right, facing the back of the courtroom. For the spectators, Trump is to the left. The prosecutors are on the opposite side, and I should note this and underscore this. Alvin Bragg is in the front row of the audience on the prosecution side, sitting in the middle seat in the front row, watching all this close up.
That's interesting. So the district attorney there inside the courtroom, not sitting at the table, but they're observing as well. And Scott, since you were there observing, what about the judge? Did he say anything? We were noting earlier, of course, that it was just this morning, the 9 o'clock Eastern Standard Time hour, that Trump took to social media to attack him and his family personally.
Well, the judge first had to deal with another challenge before this proceeding began. Obviously, it's 2:50 p.m. here on the East Coast. This was supposed to begin at 2:15 Eastern Time. What ate up some of the balance of the time was Trump arriving about 10 minutes late with his defense team into the courtroom, potentially for procedural issues, but also a lawyer representing 20 media organizations tried to open this thing up, tried to get cameras turned on, tried to allow phone use and computer use inside the courtroom, and tried to get access from some of the people in the audience, including the media, to sit in the jury box so that they could see the former president's face. I can see the former president's face because I'm watching via a remote feed in the overflow room. The judge shot down all those challenges, but Juan Marchand, the Manhattan judge handling this case, had to deal with that issue first, which is why the arraignment has just now begun. And I'll underscore, because I think it's important, Nora, the arraignment is still underway.
Scott MacFarlane, want to stay with you to get more of your account about what's happening inside that courtroom. Just to let everybody know, Donald Trump right now inside this courtroom, he arrived for his arraignment at about 2:30 p.m., taking the first steps into his life as a criminal defendant. According to Scott MacFarlane, read 34 charges against him as part of this indictment. And I'll let you describe it again for us, Scott. How exactly did it go? Who read the indictment? And then how did Trump deliver his not guilty plea?
So in the Manhattan court at arraignment, it's the clerk of the judge who reads aloud the indictment. So it was the judge's clerk, Judge Juan Marchand's clerk, who read out 34 counts of falsifying business records in the first degree. But before she did so, Nora, she read out the official case number, which is now for the history books. This is indictment number 71543-23. The dash 23, of course, is the calendar year. That's the criminal case number for this indictment. The judge, after hearing these arguments to open up or make more transparent these procedures, pledged to review the request from media for future proceedings. So this may be the first and last proceeding in this criminal case in which media are not permitted to bring phones or computers, or which cameras are turned off. So this may be the only time we're flying blind while trying to watch Donald Trump in a criminal case. But as of this moment, he is now an accused criminal in the Manhattan court system, facing 34 counts.
As Scott just noted, it is worth reminding people that what's happening inside this courtroom will not be broadcast or photographed. We just got a couple of these still pictures from the very top of it. Reporters are inside. Our own Graham Cates is inside and will bring us more details from what Scott has already mentioned. They cannot use phones or laptops to provide updates. We have to wait until the end of this proceeding. But Scott McFarlane was in an overflow room and witnessed Donald Trump plead not guilty, was able to bring us some of the initial moments from just what happened in very dramatic recounting of this incredible moment.
Scott, when the clerk read the charges to the former president, was the former president addressed as former President Trump or just called Mr. Donald John Trump?
There were different variations of that, Bob. First of all, his defense attorney, Tom Blanche, introduced him as former President Donald J. Trump, but the clerk referred to him as Donald J. Trump. And Donald J. Trump is the named defendant here. But that distinction was made between the defense counsel and the clerk. All of this is clear to hear in the courtroom and in the overflow room. And let me explain why. These are pretty moderate-sized rooms. I mean, think of a large high school classroom, maybe a small school library or cafeteria. This is a small place, and it's a grand contrast to the federal court system, to the other courts that we walk into in which there are spectacle trials or spectacle arraignments. This just feels and looks different.
Scott McFarlane, thank you. Stay with us, if you will. I know John Dickerson is here with us as well.
Scott, Eddie, you mentioned that DA Alvin Bragg is there. Anything else from the prosecution table? And also, did everybody march right in and take their seats, or was there any? Sometimes there's a little bit of milling about in which the lawyers at least nod at each other, or they have some commerce that they've already engaged in setting this moment up, and they will have to engage with each other again. Was there any of that in the courtroom?
Yeah, we see that so frequently in criminal cases where groups just kind of assemble piecemeal. That was not the case here. I mean, Secret Service is running security along with New York Police and New York State Court Police. There was a regiment here, John, where everybody was seated in place with security in place before the prosecution team arrived, which happened almost exactly at 2:15 Eastern Time. The Trump team, including the former president, arrived about 10 minutes later at 2:25 Eastern Time. But once the defendant was seated and once the defense team was seated, the judge entered moments later with the clerk, announced the initiation of this proceeding. But there was a small and micro proceeding before it, that matter of dealing with the media request for access. Once the judge disposed of that with no comment from the prosecutors or the defense attorneys, they moved on to begin this historic indictment.
I got some new reporting just in from our investigative producer, Pat Milton, noting that these charges are all Class E felonies. And to note, felonies carry prison time, misdemeanors do not. Ricky, we've been talking about this. What do you think the significance is that the district attorney's office, Bragg's office, bumped up all these charges to these Class E felonies, which I understand are the lowest class of felonies in New York State Penal Code?
Correct. From a misdemeanor punishment of a year to a Class E felony with a punishment of 4 years. The ultimate punishment is today fairly irrelevant, except for the fact that it carries more time. Because what we're dealing with here is the question of what are these charges? So it seems to me we still haven't seen the indictment, that if you're dealing with one business record that they say was falsified, that it becomes one count, and then one check becomes one count. The one thing we have learned, I think, from Scott's reporting is that this all concerns the activities involving allegedly Donald Trump with Michael Cohen, David Pecker with the National Enquirer, and Stormy Daniels, and not other charges. I think that's a big revelation, if I heard it correctly.
Scott, is that correct?
Yeah, although I'll have to admit and acknowledge that we interjected into the airwaves here by bolting out of this hearing before it was complete. There's clearly going to be a connected tissue between these charges and potentially some other misconduct or allegation. And our team in the courtroom still is going to bring that out to us in the coming minutes. But we know the top line here. The top line is 34 counts. And the news of the hour is Donald Trump pleaded not guilty.
Scott, thank you. I want to bring in Jerry Goldfeder, who's been listening along and is an election and campaign finance lawyer. And Jerry, your reaction to what we've just heard.
Well, it sounds like the campaign finance violations enabled Alvin Bragg to bump up the false business records charge to a felony. We haven't seen the indictment just yet, but that's what it sounds like. And I'm curious to ask Scott whether or not the judge has made set any deadlines for motions, motion to dismiss the indictment, motion to change venue, that kind of thing.
I'm glad you asked, because it allows me to say that this proceeding is still underway. That is likely the order of business underway, if not now, quite soon. And also, what we have from our reporting at this point is a floor, not necessarily a ceiling. We know there are 34 charges, or 34 counts of falsifying business records. It does not mean that this proceeding is over, and the rest of our CBS News team could be reporting out more allegations against the former president, potentially more charges. I just don't want to close the door on there being more added as this day goes along.
It's an excellent point. Scott, are you allowed to, I know you just left that overflow room to bring us this breaking news, are you allowed to go back in?
I'm going to make it happen, Nora.
Pressure's on.
All right, Scott. Well, why don't we are hanging on every detail that you have been reporting. So why don't you head back inside so that we can answer some of those questions, because we've got a multitude of questions about what comes next. We should also note that in addition to other reporters, our own CBS News' Graham Cates is inside the courtroom with the district attorney, with Donald Trump, with his legal team, and is taking copious and meticulous notes that he will bring to us once that proceeding is over, so we can answer some of the questions that we have, and certainly those that are watching have, about what is next, dates ahead, the specifics of the indictment that we don't yet know.
I can give you some factors, Nora, about the procedure. The district attorney's office, now by law, must turn over all discovery within 15 days. And what that means is grand jury's witness statements, any statement a witness made, any investigation, any physical evidence must be turned over. So the DA's office had to be ready at the time of the indictment to be able to turn that over. Then, as a result of the defense receiving all of this material, they will then usually have 30 to 45 days in order to be able to respond to that, and they could ask for an extension. When we get to time for motion hearings, because we've heard a lot of noise from the defense team already about filing motions to dismiss, they may be filed within a few months, but they may not be heard for a while. We are at the beginning of a long process.
And Robert, we were talking about this. This is just the initial step in what will be a very long process for the president, the legal team, and the district attorney's office.
The district attorney, Alvin Bragg, is scheduled after this arraignment is over to appear before reporters. And there is a legal battle that is now ongoing in its early phase. And there's also a public battle to win over public opinion about how people perceive this case. And it's a test for Alvin Bragg. The country doesn't know him. They are now going to very much get to know him. So his introduction of his case, his argument, his evidence will be crucial in the coming hour.
And as Ricky talks about the timeline, I started to think about there's the Georgia case in Donald Trump's efforts to try to get in the way of the election that's going on in Georgia, and then, of course, the special counsel's work. So there are a lot of other legal developments that may gallop ahead of this, because a lot of people think those cases on their face are stronger and have more of him at the center of the stage. You know, his lawyer in the documents case now has been asked by a judge to testify, piercing the attorney-client privilege with the crime fraud exception, so that he now has to talk about conversations he had with Donald Trump about whether Donald Trump asked him to obstruct justice with respect to those documents. That is serious stuff, which, given the timeline you're talking about, may gallop ahead of all of this.
And in New York, we have to remember, if we just look at Alan Weisselberg and the Trump Organization, you went from July of 21 to November of 22. So we're really talking perhaps a year and a half.
Go ahead, Jeff.
Aren't we assuming that the former president, he considers himself a fighter, we're assuming that he's going to want to fight this? Perhaps there is another way for them to handle this case, given the other cases that are sitting out there that could potentially lead to more legal jeopardy.
You're talking about a plea deal.
Yeah.
It'll never happen.
Why?
Because it's Donald Trump. He would never, under any circumstance.
But if you were representing him, would you advise him to, hey, let's make this go away?
Well, it's not going to go away because he's running for public office. And so he does not want to have a conviction behind him. And in addition, he keeps saying that he has done nothing wrong. I cannot imagine in my wildest dreams that Donald Trump would offer a plea of guilty to this case or any other case.
Just throwing that out there.
Well, it definitely got me up there.
Well, it is noteworthy, the irony, and I think you can use that word in this case, of someone who tried to carry out a hush money payment to make this all go away, and now it's turned into the first ever.
And people who really know Trump say it's that element of this case that really unsettles him, whether it was Access Hollywood and that whole experience in October 2016, or Stormy Daniels and how this has played out over the last 5 or so years. Trump has tried to keep his personal life, in certain aspects of it, contained in various ways over the course of his life. And he doesn't love when this stuff comes to the fore, even though he is defiant legally and politically right now. Just look at what we're seeing right now on screen. Look at Trump's face. Look at his body language. I'm just a reporter, but it tells you something sometimes just to see how someone's handling the moment.
And that goes back to what we were talking about earlier. For some portion of the country, they will think no one is above the law. No matter how grand you are, how many buildings have your name in front of them, no one is above the law, which doesn't mean you're guilty, just means no one's above the law and you have to go through the legal process. And others will look at this and speak of it in the apocalyptic language that Donald Trump used in his tweet on the way down there, or whatever his Truth Social posting, which was, how can this happen in America? Speak in apocalyptic terms, where this is not just a single person, but this is evidence of a corrosion in the American system. And when you raise it up to that level, you inject into the system the kind of energy that we saw after the last election that had such dangerous results.
I want to bring in Scott Frederickson, the former federal prosecutor who is paying attention to this. They can talk about the legal jeopardy that the former president faces. Scott?
Well, that's right. And I think we shouldn't forget that the defense of Donald Trump right now is probably feeling fairly confident that they have a legitimate shot to knock this case out on their motion to dismiss on the grounds that misleading falsification of business records designed to mislead for purpose of a federal campaign financial obligation doesn't qualify as fraud. I think they're going to argue that that was misleading, but it's not fraud. Now, they could lose that, but I think they're feeling very confident they can knock it out. And so they're going to go forward. And I think the second thing to keep in mind here is that there may be 34 counts here, but they're misdemeanors elevated to low-level felonies. Highly, highly unlikely that even if convicted on all 34 counts that the former president would ever see any jail time. So there's no real motivation for the president to do anything but to do his very best to knock this case out.
The breaking news at this hour, Donald Trump himself pleading not guilty to 34 counts of falsifying business records in the first degree. Our own Scott McFarland was inside an overflow room, the first to report that it was Donald Trump himself who said in a loud voice, "Not guilty." Scott McFarland also reporting that the district attorney, Alvin Bragg, inside the courtroom, sitting in the front row. We're still waiting more details about what comes next. Ricky?
One of the things that we have to remember, and I always repeat myself, but I think it's worth repeating, that in a court of law, Donald Trump is entitled, as any other citizen, to the presumption of innocence. That is not true in the court of public opinion. There's no such thing as the presumption of innocence out there in the other world. So it brings us back to John Dickerson's point that we have both the legal world and the political world, which I say are colliding here. So Donald Trump can go forward with all of the protections in court, and he will go forward with his lawyers and contest the law of this case. The law of this case is going to be really the big question, because if it gets to a Manhattan jury, I think we know what the probability of a guilty verdict might be.
Because Manhattanites tend to be more Democratic in their political affiliation?
Correct. And there has certainly been enough noise against Donald Trump in recent times in Manhattan. But the law is going to be what determines if a jury gets this. Now, while saying that, too, I just said he's entitled to the presumption of innocence, and the defense knows it only takes one juror to hang that jury.
That's why Donald Trump has said himself he would favor moving this trial to Staten Island, where there tend to be more conservative voters in the borough of Staten Island.
Which is so funny because it's not like Texas. You know, Staten Island, it's more conservative by New York standards.
Yes, absolutely. I want to also bring in and bring up this point, follow up on this point, I should say, rather, that Scott talked about. Why and under what basis can Donald Trump's attorneys make the case to quickly dismiss these charges? What legal standing do they have?
Well, they always have the right to file a motion to dismiss about the law. They also have another right that is peculiar to New York, and it's called a Clayton motion. And what a Clayton motion is that you say it is in the interest of justice, regardless of the merits of the case, to dismiss this case. So they have two ways to go about it. One other part of the motion to dismiss that we know, according to Donald Trump's lawyer, Joe Tacopina, that they're looking at is not only do they believe that there is not a law that prevents this case, that allows this case to go forward, and that this is a misreading of the law, but they also claim that there's a statute of limitations issue. All of these are ethical and proper motions for a defense lawyer to make. Whether or not they're going to be granted is way down the road. And if they're not, it's going to a trial. Because, Jeff, I know you were provoking, but there is never going to be a plea.
And just to build on Ricky's points, when I was talking in the last 24 hours to Trump's attorneys, they say they're going to make a case in the dismissal motion that Trump is being selectively prosecuted in this case, that because he's a former president, a Republican, that he is being prosecuted for that reason. So that is going to be at least part of the argument they are making as they try to dismiss this relatively quickly in the coming weeks.
Just want to note now, Donald Trump has been inside that courtroom for about 40 minutes now. He entered at about 2:30 Eastern time. According to our own Scott McFarland, who witnessed the proceedings inside from an overflow room, the Manhattan prosecutors accused Donald Trump of trying to cover up a potential sex scandal during the 2016 presidential campaign with hush money payments. They were bumped up, these charges, to Class E felonies, meaning that this conduct essentially was intended to conceal another underlying crime. This now opens Trump up to not only be the first president or former president indicted, but now to face criminal charges. We are awaiting many more details from what's happening inside this courtroom, as no doubt his attorneys are trying to move to dismiss this case. Dates set, more particular specifics about the indictment that we still don't know. All we know, according to Scott McFarland, was that it was Donald Trump himself who said in a loud voice, "Not guilty."
And as Ricky so eloquently explained, this is going to take a lot of time we're looking at weeks and months ahead. And politically, John, I'm so curious how this is going to play out as you have an ongoing Republican presidential race. What's coming up this summer? Debates, primary debates. Then you're going to have major election nights next year in 2024. And so you're going to have an ongoing potential trial while someone runs for the presidency of the United States and could even be convicted of a crime down the line and serve in the American presidency.
And not just in this case. The E. Jean Carroll case is, I think, being heard next week, where Joe Tacopino is defending him against a charge of rape. A civil case. Then there is the January 6th case. There is the documents, the classified documents found at Mar-a-Lago, the Georgia case. What's the timeline on those other cases?
Well, I thought the Georgia case, the judge who ruled about whether the information could be released to the public said, I don't want to do that until there is an indictment, because there were indictments that were expected to come as a result of that. But of course, there was a special grand jury that met, and then they had to impanel another regular grand jury. So,
but haven't done that yet in Georgia. Fani Willis has not made a decision on whether she's going to convene a regular grand jury to issue criminal indictments in Georgia. Here's the one clue we have about the special counsel. What is he doing? Actions always speak. He keeps compelling everyone at the highest level to testify as soon as possible. This special counsel, Jack Smith, keeps going before the judge and says, I don't care about the privilege argument. Bring him in. We need this testimony. That's a sign he wants to move quickly.
And in that special counsel's case, what were the new developments just this morning happening in Washington?
In the January 6th investigation led by the special counsel and the prosecution keeps gaining ground in terms of bringing in people like Mark Meadows, the former White House chief of staff, John Ratcliffe, the former director of national intelligence, Robert O'Brien, the former national security advisor. Those are not just political advisors. You have the special counsel looking at the national security apparatus and getting a judge to agree with the special counsel's position as they move toward possible prosecution, that we need to hear from these people as soon as possible.
I want to go now to Scott McFarlane, who witnessed the first part of this hearing that Donald Trump inside this courtroom, where criminal charges were read against him. Scott, recap what you saw inside.
Let's underscore the significance of the fact that a former president of the United States now has an official case number in the criminal court system. He is case number 71543-23, according to the Manhattan court system. That's his indictment number. The clerk of the judge, Judge Juan Marchand, read out this indictment, that it was 34 counts of falsifying business records in the first degree. Immediately, Donald Trump was asked how he pleads to that charge. Now, as is past practice in this courthouse, a defense attorney could do that, or the defendant could do that. Donald Trump chose to do that, said not guilty. This proceeding has so much more to unfold still. There are going to be some references, we expect, to whatever connection the falsified business records might have to other alleged misconduct by the former president. There may be a request for a gag order in this case. And I'll note, it's been nearly an hour now. Donald Trump's been in that courtroom. We'll find out likely soon whether such a motion was made. They're also going to have to get some scheduling matters taken care of. When does this happen next? When does Donald Trump return here, if he has to return for a next proceeding in this case? But a lot of what started off this set of proceedings today, back and forth between an attorney for 20 media organizations and the judge about opening this thing up to cameras, to cell phones in the courtroom, to laptops in the courtroom, to moving media members to different spots in the courtroom so they get a better look at Donald Trump's face. All of those requests were rejected for now. But Nora, the judge in this case here in Manhattan, says he might revisit those rulings the next time they convene in this criminal case.
How did Donald Trump appear to you?
It was noteworthy that he walked in slowly, sat with nothing in his hands. So often when you go watch a criminal case in person, Nora, the defendant's got a pen and paper. The defense has something to make note of what's happening on this day, this most important day of his or her life. Donald Trump had nothing in his hands. They were folded in his lap. He was kind of slumped over at the low-level desk. There was a red velvet rope, kind of like you'd see at a museum to keep you away from the fine arts and the fine exhibits, that separated the defense table and prosecution's table from the audience, from those in the gallery. But I got to tell you, it was a really relatively small courtroom, big by the standards of the Manhattan courthouse, but small in general. I counted about 20 or 30 people as spectators in that room. There was an adjacent overflow room with another 10 or 20 of us, and we were a little more liberated to leave the courtroom before the proceedings ended. Those in the courtroom are fixed there, likely by Secret Service request or security request, until all of this is over.
When you talked about that red velvet rope, it reminded me of the most recent pictures of Donald Trump at his own club in Mar-a-Lago, where he sits in the middle of the dining room and ropes himself off from other members of his own club while he's having dinner on a Saturday night in an unusual sort of circumstance. Robert?
Just an additional note, when you look at that picture right now, the person at the end of the row is a Trump advisor and lawyer named Boris Epshteyn. And he is someone who has become a confidant of the former president. He's close to the Trump family, close to the Trump sons in particular. He's also quite notable to be sitting there at the table with the former president at this critical moment, legally and politically, because
it's raising some eyebrows.
Well, it's raising eyebrows because his phone, Boris Epshteyn's phone, was seized by federal agents as part of the January 6th investigation. Who is Boris Epshteyn, if you haven't been following every day? Well, he's someone who was very close to Rudy Giuliani for a long time. And when Giuliani was right there with Trump after November 2020, working to try to overturn the election, who was at Giuliani's side? Boris Epshteyn. So Giuliani was Trump's right-hand man in that post and pre-January 6th period, and Boris was that to Rudy.
I understand that Epshteyn is also represented by Todd Blanche, who is now part of this.
And part of how Todd Blanche, we're told, was brought into the legal team is because he's friendly with Boris Epshteyn, friendly and representing him.
And Boris actually also goes back to the Russia investigation, which is where we first met him, is in connection with the Russia investigation. He was also under scrutiny, not accused of anything officially, wasn't facing any charges, but he was sort of in that orbit that people investigating were looking at.
I want to bring in our senior investigative correspondent, Catherine Herridge, who has been talking to her sources. Catherine?
Thank you, Nora. Heading into the arraignment this week, one of the Trump attorneys, James Trusty, he's representing the former president in the classified documents case. He told CBS News that the legal team anticipated that there may be what they described as a fatal flaw in the charges that would be brought today. And they were focused on what we've heard Nikki talk about and others, this intent to defraud. Trusty made the point to CBS News that intent to defraud must show more than just an intent to deceive. It must also show that there was an intent to deny an individual or individuals of properties or financial assets. And they think that will be a very stiff climb in this case. Trusty, as I mentioned, is also part of the Mar-a-Lago classified documents case. And he pointed to the fact that other attorneys in that case have been present before the grand jury for the special counsel, and most notably Tim Parlatore. Parlatore told me personally that when he went to the grand jury in December, that he felt his testimony to the grand jury was unexpected and unhelpful, his words, to the special counsel, because he argued that his actions and the actions of the former president did not show a willfulness to retain the records, rather what he described as a willingness to provide back the records once they had been identified. So you can see from the scope of the reporting that it's very broad disagreement as to the strength of the special counsel investigation. Now the Trump people say they don't think it's building to an outcome that would be undesirable to them. But as we just heard from Bob and others, they have a very different perspective on that investigation.
Catherine, thank you. I want to bring in our lawyers and former prosecutors who are with us, because these 34 counts, these felonies, center around falsifying business records in the first degree. I'm actually looking at the state code right now, and a person is guilty of falsifying business records in the first degree when he commits the crime of falsifying business records in the second degree, and when his intent to defraud includes an intent to commit another crime or to aid or conceal the commission thereof. Might have to listen to it slowly, but I want to explain it because, again, this has come up multiple times. Why is a hush money payment to a person that he is alleged to have had an affair with, why is that illegal? What is it that they have indicted him on? What is it that they have been able to prove that the Trump legal team is going to try to dismiss and try and win over?
Well, you're dealing with the last clause, which is it's concealment of a crime. And what you have here, it's not only Donald Trump who has, over the years, allegedly paid hush money to people to keep his sexual trysts secret. And that's perfectly legal. You can do that. You sign an agreement with someone, you have a non-disclosure, you're fine. But as always, it's the cover-up that becomes worse than the crime. So here, what the essence of these charges really looks to is the business records themselves, which were a scheme that had, allegedly, the payment to repay Michael Cohen classified as a business expense for legal fees. Michael Cohen paid Stormy Daniels $130,000 because he took out a home equity loan. He wanted the money back.
Mm-hmm. On this very point, if people are saying, well, is this a novel thing that what Donald Trump was doing? Is this something different? I was reading in, and according to the New York Times, the false business records charge is the bread and butter of the district attorney's office white-collar practice, and that since Bragg took office in 2022, prosecutors have filed 117 felony counts of the charge against 29 individuals and companies. So the bread and butter, meaning they do this.
Yes.
This is something that people do.
It's not unusual. However, it's unusual to combine it with a federal campaign violation if, in fact, that's what's there. We still haven't seen it.
And that's what makes it the felony charge.
Correct.
Want to bring in Jerry on that point, because explain for viewers the legal charge, the legal basis behind what they're bringing against Donald Trump.
Well, if we're right in trying to analyze this indictment, which we haven't seen, the payment to Stormy Daniels, if it was done in furtherance of the campaign to quiet her down, to make sure that she didn't speak so it didn't harm his campaign, that really is can be characterized as an in-kind contribution to his campaign, but he didn't report it as such. And not only that, but it wasn't in the true name of the source. Cohen paid the money, but Trump paid Cohen back. So you have those two election law violations, state election law violations. And what's novel here, as you said, is combining the false records with a campaign violation, an election law violation. You know, I think Ricky is probably almost 100% right that he will fight this and never give in, never plea. But, you know, Trump University.
Okay.
You have to watch the former president right now?
That's right.
Okay.
We just saw him exit the courtroom after what appears to be an almost hour-long appearance, because he entered at about 2:30. As I noted, we have had a reporter inside, Graham Cates, inside that courtroom, witnessing everything that we saw, as well as that will add to the details that we already heard from Scott McFarland. This was supposed to be a quick hearing. At least that's what we heard. It was going to be like 20 minutes. Lasted an hour. It's a specific and important case, no doubt. And we're all anxious to hear details of what happened inside.
And what's in the actual indictment. I mean, we finally...
Checking the email right now.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm looking. I'm
while
refreshing.
you check, can I ask a question of Ricky, which is, barring some theatrics, is there a reason that it would take that long just on the indictment itself? Reading it out, or is there some process that would take an hour, or does an hour tell you something?
Well, I think an hour is rather long for an indictment, but we don't know what happened in terms of scheduling. We don't know if there were arguments about any other kinds of motions. We really don't know until we find out from people who were in that courtroom. An hour is long for an arraignment. They usually take about 10, 15 minutes tops. And then the judge says, and the next date that you will be here for a status hearing is February, March, whatever it may happen to be, and I'm using past months intentionally, that it should not have taken this long. So something happened in there, and we'll find out what it was.
Ricky, play this out for us as a lawyer. Let's say this first-time offender, Donald Trump, is ultimately convicted of this crime, of these 34 charges. What kind of prison sentence, if any, could they face? What kind of penalty could Trump have in his future if he's ultimately convicted?
He's facing he's facing a discretionary 4 years in prison, because these are 34 counts, we are told, but they don't stack them one on top of another because it's all part of one scheme. So it would be looked at really, in essence, as one factor, and so you would have a 4-year penalty. Do I expect that Donald Trump is going to prison on this particular case? Should he be convicted of a jury of his peers where 12 people believe the evidence beyond a reasonable doubt? No, I do not expect him to go to prison.
That word you use, discretionary. Who has the discretion?
The judge, 100%. It is in any case, both sides will argue. The judge decides.
And we now see Donald Trump in the motorcade leaving the Manhattan courthouse after pleading not guilty to 34 felony counts of falsifying business records. We have new details coming in right now about what happened inside the courtroom. Let's bring in Scott McFarland. Scott?
Nora, Donald Trump spent exactly 1 hour inside that courtroom for departing. He arrived at 2:25 p.m. Eastern Time, departing here 3:25 p.m. Eastern Time. I can tell you from the part of this proceeding we saw, the overwhelming majority of this proceeding was not the reading of the charges. It was not the arraignment. There was some litigation about opening these proceedings up to media, and there were some number of arguments or discussions after the reading of the charges. And we're about to find out what those included. Is there a possibility there was an argument over a possible gag order? Sure, that's been talked about in recent days. We do know, as Donald Trump exited, he did not address the cameras that were there, in which some people predicted he might speak to. So we're going to find out in the coming minutes what else was included in this hour-long hearing. The arraignment, the actual filing of these 34 charges, took just moments. There's a lot still to find out.
Scott McFarland, thank you. We do expect that Donald Trump's motorcade will head straight to LaGuardia Airport, where his red, white, and blue plane with his name emblazoned on it in gold will depart back for Palm Beach and to his private club, Mar-a-Lago, where he is expected to speak tonight. He was expected, according to one advisor, to perhaps address the cameras while inside the courtroom, but he did not. And we'll learn probably why, but he looked stone-faced, I guess is the best way to describe it, while entering and exiting the courtroom.
As we wait to find out the details of this, something when Ricky was talking struck me. If there are 34 counts and they are associated with these checks, we shouldn't forget that there has been reporting, or there's been the suggestion that some of these checks were written while he was president of the United States. And that will be something to look for. So in other words, it may be the same check, but the dates on the checks will be, at least politically, quite significant if some of those dates, some of those checks in this allegations or in this indictment were while he was president of the United States.
Well, again, it's the collision, if you will, of the political world and the legal world. That is a factor that could be very important in the future in the political world. It's not a factor that I expect it has any relevance in Alvin Bragg's indictment. So what we're looking at here are, as they used to say, just the facts, ma'am, just the facts. And the facts here are very straightforward. It's the law that is not. But politically, John, depending on what happens in the future, when we deal with the 2024 elections, the fact that he may have signed these checks while he was president of the United States does create a very interesting wrinkle.
What does it create a new legal wrinkle?
Well, it doesn't create necessarily a new legal wrinkle, but it certainly might give fuel to the fire if someone is looking at a future of saying, well, we can't have him be president, and how do you wind up getting rid of someone who might become president, you have to impeach them. So private conduct doesn't really get us to that level, but conduct while you were president of the United States just might. But that's so far in the future that it takes us away from the present day.
I've been texting with advisors and associates of Trump, asking if they're surprised Trump didn't speak to reporters outside the courtroom. And they said no. They said Trump is a Florida resident now in every sense, politically, culturally. He doesn't like what New York has become for him, the experience of him being in New York, a fortified Trump Tower. He can't go to the 21 Club down the street anymore and have a bite to eat and be greeted by people in the streets. It's a different New York for Donald Trump, and he was given a bracing reminder of that today in Lower Manhattan.
In fact, even when it's hot in the summer in Florida, Trump does not come back. He goes out to Bedford, New Jersey.
Bedminster, New Jersey.
Bedminster, New Jersey, different place than Bedford, New York, and spends his summers out there.
He's going back to his plane, the Boeing 757 now, often parked at LaGuardia Airport. That has long been the place he flies in and out of. This campaign plane was shuttered for a long time, but it has been now put back on the campaign trail for Trump. He's been using it at recent rallies. He'll be flying back to Florida in that aircraft before he goes on to Mar-a-Lago.
And I wonder, as they drive up Manhattan and through the city, if he's reminiscing a little bit. A lot of the buildings that he is passing used to have his name on them. And now those names have been taken down. So the city has changed a lot since he became president in terms of how it relates to Donald Trump.
We've noted that Trump first faced criminal investigations in the 1970s. He has avoided criminal charges up until today as a former president of the United States. But while under investigation and while challenged throughout his life, Trump has used two main tactics: attack and delay. He has been on the attack since this morning. His sons are on the attack as they are personally going after the district attorney and the judge in this case. There will not be a gag order, we believe, in this case. It would be difficult to enforce, as Ricky Kleeman has noted. How does this play out?
And who joins the attack? If you are, there's the 2024 candidates, but anybody engaged in public life, because this is an attack on the judicial system, you attack it for the purposes of undermining whatever finally happens to the president. So who chooses to join in that attack? And there's a cost to doing so, because you're basically saying this is an illegitimate proceeding. That's a very dangerous thing to say.
And on the legal side, delay, 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 which is always the defense point of view. The prosecutor wants to go forward quickly as possible. They want to get this done. And the defense always wants to delay, because delay always benefits every criminal defendant.
You think back to Michael Cohen is at the center of this case, but when I was watching those images come in of Donald Trump sitting there in the courtroom, I was thinking not of Michael Cohen, but of Roy Cohn, Trump's longtime advisor, now passed, but someone who was of New York, of the legal community, highly controversial for his ethical decisions over the course of his career. I was thinking about Roger Stone. I mean, there was a combative advisor and lawyer almost always at Trump's side. He had a few of them today, but it's an entirely different context, a different stage of his life, running again for the presidency. And he's not now the man on page 6. He's a former president of the United States of America, coming back to Manhattan.
And now launching another bid for the presidency, which you have noted will largely become part of his grievance campaign, as he will use that as a means to run for president.
And who's watching this? Who's watching this in the Republican Party? Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, Governor Youngkin, maybe a rising member of the United States Senate, and wonder, is this a moment of political vulnerability, not just legal vulnerability?
And what do you think?